We're heading back to ancient Mesopotamia. Not for kings, not for wars, and not even for dramatic family trees collapsing under their own genetic weight. No. Tonight, we're talking about brick making. Yes, actual bricks, mud bricks, sun-dried bricks, and occasionally baked bricks when someone was feeling ambitious or had access to fire and time. So get comfortable, adjust your pillow, lower the volume just a little too much, and let your mind gently wander as we spend the next while with some very patient people standing ankle-deep in river mud, quietly wondering how this became their life. Now, Mesopotamia. The classic phrase you probably half remember from school is the cradle of civilization. It sounds warm and nurturing. In reality, it was more like a very hot, dusty basin between two unpredictable rivers, where survival required constant effort, and complaining probably hadn't been invented yet. The Tigris and the Euphrates were rivers that flooded whenever they felt like it. Not politely, not on a schedule, just surprise. Sometimes they brought fertile silt and prosperity. Sometimes they brought destruction and the emotional experience of watching your house melt back into the ground. This mattered because there was one thing Mesopotamia did not have in abundance: stone. If you wanted stone, you had to import it from far away, over land, using animals that were also tired. So instead, the people of Mesopotamia looked around at what they did have, and what they had was mud. So much mud. Mud from riverbanks, mud from floodplains, mud that stuck to everything and absolutely ruined sandals. At some point, probably after a long day of watching walls collapse, someone thought, what if we just shaped the mud and let the sun deal with it? And just like that, civilization quietly became rectangular. Early Mesopotamian bricks were not glamorous. They were made from clay-rich mud mixed with water and often reinforced with straw. Not because straw was cute, but because it helped prevent cracking as the bricks dried, which is a level of foresight that deserves more respect than it gets. You'd mix the mud with your feet. There were no mixers, no gloves, just vibes and calves of steel. The straw, usually leftover agricultural waste, was chopped up and blended in. It added tensile strength, which is a fancy way of saying it stopped your wall from falling apart immediately. The mixture was then pressed into wooden molds, simple rectangles, nothing fancy, no branding, no artisanal stamp saying handcrafted by Ur-Nammu, just mud shaped with hope. Once molded, the bricks were slid out and laid in the sun, and then you waited. The Mesopotamian sun did most of the work, which was efficient, free, and deeply unforgiving. Sun-dried bricks, also called adobe, were surprisingly sturdy in dry conditions. They worked well until it rained, or flooded, or the river decided it was feeling dramatic. This brings us to the strange contradiction of Mesopotamian brick culture. They built entire cities out of material that could theoretically dissolve back into the earth, and yet they kept doing it for thousands of years. Because when your options are mud or nothing, mud becomes tradition. Not all bricks were sun-dried. Some were fired in kilns. These were stronger, more water-resistant, and much more work. Firing bricks required fuel, usually wood, which was not abundant, so baked bricks were reserved for special projects: temples, city walls, and ziggurats, important things that gods might notice. The ziggurat, by the way, was essentially a massive tiered tower made almost entirely of brick, with layers of sun-dried bricks on the inside and baked bricks on the exterior to protect against weather. Think of it like a giant cake, but instead of frosting, it's fired clay, and instead of joy, it inspires existential humility. Here's the wild part. These bricks were often stamped, not with decorative designs, but with inscriptions. Kings loved this. They stamped bricks with their names, titles, and reminders that yes, they built this, and yes, you should remember that. Archaeologists today are basically reading ancient bragging rights one brick at a time. Now imagine being the person making the bricks, not the king or the priest, just a brickworker. Your contribution to history is holding a mold, filling it with mud, smoothing the top, and placing it next to 10,000 identical bricks. And yet, here we are, still talking about it. Brick production was seasonal, usually happening during the dry months when the sun was reliable and the rivers were calm. Large projects required massive coordination, thousands, tens of thousands, sometimes millions of bricks. Workers were organized, molds standardized, dimensions consistent. This wasn't chaos, it was early industrial planning without spreadsheets or emails, just people, mud, and expectations. Bricks varied by region and time period. Some were thick, some thin, some slightly trapezoidal, because straight lines are harder than they look when you're standing in mud. Mortar was usually more mud, though sometimes bitumen was used, adding water resistance and a strong smell. Imagine a city that smelled of warm clay, wet earth, and asphalt. Not awful, but not subtle. Over time, brickmaking became deeply embedded in Mesopotamian life. It wasn't just construction, it was economy, labor, identity. Cities rose because bricks existed. Administration expanded because buildings existed. Writing happened because someone had a wall to lean a tablet against, which is a lot to put on mud. Kings came and went, often dramatically, but the bricks stayed. They eroded, were repaired, and were reused. Old bricks were scavenged from ruins and placed into new walls. History literally recycled itself. Sometimes inscriptions were upside down because no one cared. The king was gone and the brick still worked. And that's kind of the theme. Mesopotamian brickmaking wasn't flashy or meant to be remembered. It was practical, persistent, and quietly revolutionary. It allowed people to settle permanently, to build upward, and to imagine cities as lasting things, even when the materials said otherwise. Later civilizations got marble and granite and monuments that screamed permanence. Mesopotamia did it the hard way, with sun-baked rectangles and a lot of patience. And honestly, there's something very on-brand about humanity's first major architectural tradition being extremely fragile, constantly maintained, and dependent on good weather. Of course it was. And as we gently drift onward, we'll float next into how these humble bricks shaped entire cityscapes, social hierarchies, and daily routines of people who probably never imagined someone thousands of years later listening to a sleepy voice talk about their mud. For now, just let the image sit. Rows of bricks, drying quietly under a wide Mesopotamian sky. No rush, no drama, just mud becoming history. And here's the wild part. These bricks were often stamped, not with decorative designs, but with inscriptions. Kings loved this, absolutely loved it. They stamped bricks with their names, titles, and reminders that yes, they built this, and yes, you should remember that. Which means archaeologists today are basically reading ancient bragging rights one brick at a time. This temple was built by King so-and-so, mighty ruler, chosen by the gods, on a brick, in a wall that someone laid by hand, probably while sweating quietly. Now imagine being the person making the bricks, not the king, not the priest, just a brickworker. Your contribution to history is holding a mold, filling it with mud, smoothing the top, and placing it next to 10,000 identical bricks, and yet here we are, still talking about it. Brick production was seasonal, usually happening during the dry months when the sun was reliable and the rivers were calm, which makes sense because no one wants to dry bricks in the rain. That's just watching mud return to mud. Large projects required massive coordination. Thousands of bricks, tens of thousands, sometimes millions. Workers were organized, molds standardized, Dimensions kept consistent, which is quietly impressive. This wasn't chaos. This was early industrial planning without spreadsheets or emails, just people, mud, and expectations. The bricks themselves varied by region and time period, some thick, some thin, some slightly trapezoidal, because straight lines are harder than they look when you're standing in mud. Mortar was usually more mud, though sometimes bitumen was used, adding water resistance and a strong smell. Imagine a city that smelled like warm clay, wet earth, and asphalt. Not awful, but not subtle. Over time, brickmaking became deeply embedded in Mesopotamian life. It wasn't just construction, it was economy, labor, identity. Cities rose because bricks existed, administration expanded because buildings existed, and writing happened because someone had a wall to lean a tablet against, which is a lot to put on mud. Kings came and went, often dramatically, but the bricks stayed. They eroded, were repaired, and reused. Old bricks were scavenged from ruins and placed into new walls. History literally recycled itself. Sometimes inscriptions were upside down because no one cared. The king was gone and the brick still worked. And that's kind of the theme. Mesopotamian brickmaking wasn't flashy or meant to be remembered. It was practical, persistent, and quietly revolutionary. It allowed people to settle permanently, to build upward, and to imagine cities as lasting things, even when the materials said otherwise. Later civilizations got marble and granite and monuments that screamed permanence. Mesopotamia did it the hard way, with sun-baked rectangles and a lot of patience. And honestly, there's something very on-brand about humanity's first major architectural tradition being extremely fragile, constantly maintained, and dependent on good weather. Of course it was. And as we gently drift onward, we'll float next into how these humble bricks shaped entire cityscapes, social hierarchies, and the daily routines of people who probably never imagined someone thousands of years later listening to a sleepy voice talk about their mud. For now, just let the image sit. Rows of bricks drying quietly under a wide Mesopotamian sky. No rush, no drama, just mud becoming history. And now that the bricks exist, quietly drying, patiently waiting, the cities begin to take shape around them. Not all at once, not dramatically, but gradually, like something realizing what it is while it's already happening. Streets emerge first, not planned so much as worn into existence by feet, carts, and repetition, narrow paths winding between walls that were never meant to be permanent but somehow became familiar. Houses cluster close together because brickmaking is communal, and heat is easier to endure when shared, and privacy is a luxury that comes later in history. Most homes are modest, 1 or 2 rooms at most, built around small courtyards that let in light and air, because even 5,000 years ago, people understood that you need somewhere to breathe. Roofs are flat, made of wooden beams layered with reeds and mud, which means they leak sometimes and sag sometimes and require constant attention, but they also become living spaces, places to sleep on hot nights, to dry food, to watch the sky slowly change color at the end of the day. The bricks shape not just buildings but routines. Mornings begin with sweeping dust from thresholds, afternoons with repairing cracks before they grow ambitious, evenings with the quiet understanding that maintenance is never finished, only paused. And as cities grow denser, brick walls start doing more than holding roofs. They organize society itself. Wealth becomes visible in thickness, in baked bricks instead of sun-dried ones, in bitumen mortar instead of plain mud, in walls that resist rain just a little longer than everyone else's. Temples rise higher than houses, not because the gods demanded height, but because height is impressive, and humans have always equated vertical distance with importance. These structures dominate skylines made otherwise of low, earth-toned rectangles, and they act as anchors. visual, spiritual, administrative, around which everything else orbits. Ziggurats in particular become statements made of labor, thousands of people contributing bricks they will never see stacked into a form they will never climb, except perhaps once during a festival, feeling very small and very mortal and very impressed. Around these monumental brick cores, bureaucracies quietly flourish. Storage rooms appear, thick-walled and cool, designed to protect grain from heat and pests, which means surplus, which means accounting, which means someone needs to keep track of who brought what and when and how much is still left. And suddenly bricks are holding not just food, but systems. Clay tablets get pressed against brick walls while numbers are counted, symbols scratched, promises recorded, disputes settled, all because a flat surface happened to be nearby. Writing doesn't emerge in a vacuum, it leans, literally, on architecture. And the people whose lives revolve around these bricks rarely think of them as revolutionary. For them, brick-making is just work, repetitive, physical, seasonal, something learned young and practiced until the motions become automatic. Children carry water, chop straw, fetch broken bricks to be crushed and reused, absorbing the rhythm of labor before they understand its purpose. Adults measure time not by calendars, but by walls completed, by kilns fired, by the slow satisfaction of seeing a structure stand where yesterday there was only mud. There is pride here, but it's quiet, practical pride, the kind that comes from knowing your wall didn't collapse this year. And even conflict bends itself around brick. City walls grow thicker when neighbors feel threatening, gates narrower, watchtowers higher, all of it a response to fear shaped in clay. When cities fall, they don't explode into rubble, they slump, erode, soften, returning gradually to the floodplain that birthed them. New settlers arrive generations later and reuse the same bricks, sometimes without knowing, sometimes without caring, building atop layers of previous lives, each city literally standing on the compressed remains of earlier ones. Archaeological tells, those artificial hills scattered across Mesopotamia, are nothing more than accumulated brick debris, centuries of construction and decay stacked patiently by time. Which means that every step someone takes across that landscape is a step across history, across homes and temples and storage rooms and kitchens and courtyards that once echoed with voices now long gone. And through all of this, brickmaking remains stubbornly unchanged. Mud, water, straw, sun. The technology improves slightly, molds standardized a bit more, firing techniques refined, but the core idea stays the same because it works well enough, and civilization often runs on well enough. Even when empires rise and fall, when languages shift, when gods change names or get replaced entirely, people are still out there in the dry season, ankle-deep in mud, shaping rectangles and laying them out under the sky. There's something grounding about that continuity, something deeply human in the refusal to reinvent what already holds. And maybe that's why Mesopotamian cities feel less like monuments and more like organisms, constantly repaired, endlessly adapted, never finished. They breathe dust, they sweat heat, they crack and heal and crack again. Life inside them follows the same pattern, resilient, repetitive, quietly persistent. People wake, work, eat, argue, celebrate, grieve, all within walls that will outlast them by decades or centuries, walls that don't care who they shelter as long as someone keeps patching the cracks. And when rain finally comes, when floods swell and water creeps into streets and courtyards, everyone understands the risk they accepted by choosing mud over stone, but they also understand the trade-off they never really had a choice about. Because brick is what made permanence possible here, even if that permanence was fragile, even if it demanded constant attention. And maybe that's the deeper lesson hidden in all this quiet labor, that civilization isn't built from materials that last forever, but from materials people are willing to maintain together. Mesopotamia didn't endure because its bricks were strong. It endured because its people kept making them, over and over, generation after generation, trusting that something meaningful could come from mud if they were patient enough. And as the sun sets over those ancient cities, over flat roofs and towering ziggurats and walls still warm from the day's heat, the bricks just sit there, holding everything gently in place, not asking to be remembered, not demanding admiration, just doing their job, waiting for tomorrow, waiting for mud to become history again. By this point, the bricks have fully faded into the background of daily life, which is how you know they're doing something important, because the most influential things usually stop being noticed first. People don't wake up thinking about bricks. They wake up thinking about heat, about food, about whether the river behaved overnight, about whether the wall they patched yesterday is still standing this morning, and most of the time it is, barely, which is enough. Inside these brick-built cities, life unfolds at a human scale. Meals cooked in small hearths pressed against walls that retain warmth just a little longer than the air. Conversations carried through courtyards where sound bounces softly off clay surfaces. Children tracing shapes in dust that collects predictably at the base of every wall. The bricks absorb everything: smoke, voices, footsteps, the slow erosion of time. They become surfaces of memory, even if no one thinks of them that way. And because brick buildings require maintenance, repair becomes a social act. Neighbors help reinforce shared walls. Families recoat surfaces with fresh mud after floods. Knowledge passes hand to hand, not written down, but understood. How wet the mixture should be, how long to wait before drying, how to spot a crack before it becomes a collapse. This shared responsibility quietly binds communities together, because nothing reveals dependence like realizing your roof leans on someone else's wall. Over generations, neighborhoods develop personalities shaped by their bricks. Some areas rebuilt often, layered thick with history. Others newer, cleaner, their edges still sharp. Markets form in open spaces where buildings leave gaps, shaded by awnings tied directly into walls, turning architecture into infrastructure for trade. Storage jars lean against brick surfaces because they always have. Animals brush past corners, rounding them smooth. The city becomes a network of habits reinforced by clay. And beyond practicality, bricks begin to shape how people think. Straight lines encourage order. Enclosures create privacy. Doorways define thresholds, not just physical ones, but social ones, places where roles shift between inside and outside, family and public life. Even authority takes on a brick-shaped form. Officials sit behind walls. Temples loom behind walls. Power becomes something enclosed, elevated, protected by layers of sun-dried effort. When disputes arise, they happen in courtyards or at gates, spaces defined by brick geometry, because those are the places designed for gathering and judgment. And slowly, subtly, people begin to associate stability with walls that hold, with cities that don't dissolve after one bad season. This expectation that things should stay standing changes everything. It encourages planning, inheritance, long-term thinking. Why store brain if the building might not survive the year? Why record a contract if there's nowhere safe to keep it? Bricks answer these questions, not perfectly, but convincingly enough. And when disaster does strike, and it always does, the response isn't abandonment, but rebuilding. Bricks get reused, rubble gets reshaped, the city slumps and then rises again, slightly altered, slightly higher, layered atop itself like a memory refusing to fade. This cycle becomes so normal that destruction stops feeling like an ending and starts feeling like a pause. Even conquest adapts to brick logic. Victors don't erase cities, they occupy them, repair them, stamp their own names onto new bricks, and insert themselves into the existing layers. Power changes hands, but the walls remain stubbornly familiar. And through all of this, the workers continue, anonymous, repetitive, essential. Their hands crack, their backs ache, their names disappear, but their output defines the skyline. They don't leave statues, they leave alignment. They don't write history, they support it. And maybe that's why Mesopotamian civilization feels so grounded compared to later stone-heavy cultures. It doesn't pretend to be eternal. It accepts erosion as part of existence. It assumes that survival is a process, not a state. The bricks embody that philosophy perfectly, strong enough to matter, fragile enough to demand care. As centuries pass, the cities expand outward, then inward, then upward again, always constrained by the same basic material logic. No sudden leap replaces brick, no revolutionary alternative sweeps it away. Progress here is incremental, layered, patient. And when eventually these cities are abandoned, due to shifting rivers, changing trade routes, exhausted land, the bricks don't vanish, they soften, crumble, blend back into soil, becoming the very ground future people will stand on, unaware that they're walking across compressed lives. Which feels fitting, because bricks were never meant to be immortal, they were meant to be useful, together, for a while. And in that quiet purpose, they carried civilization farther than anyone standing ankle-deep in mud could have imagined. So as we linger here a little longer, listening to the faint echoes of work and weather and waiting, it's worth appreciating the humility of it all. No grand material, no dramatic permanence, just repeated effort and shared maintenance, holding the world upright, one sun-dried rectangle at a time. By now, the bricks have outlived nearly everyone who ever touched them, which is not something they were designed to do, but something they ended up doing anyway, simply by being replaced, repaired, and reabsorbed into new versions of the same places. Time in Mesopotamia doesn't move forward so much as it stacks, each generation laying itself gently on top of the previous one, compressing memory into layers of clay and dust. A house becomes a ruin, the ruin becomes a foundation, the foundation becomes a floor someone sweeps every morning without knowing whose ceiling it once was. And this layering quietly reshapes the land itself. Cities slowly rise above the floodplain not because anyone planned elevation, but because debris accumulates, brick by brick, collapse by collapse, rebuild by rebuild, until the ground beneath daily life is made mostly of former lives. These artificial hills, tells, dot the landscape, unremarkable to the people living on them, but dense with history, each step pressing down on centuries of labor. And even as empires change names and borders blur, brickmaking continues as a constant background hum, unaffected by ideology, loyalty, or ambition. Kings may issue decrees, priests may reinterpret the gods, administrators may invent new ways to count grain, but none of that matters if the walls don't hold. So the work continues, season after season, carried out by people who understand that the future depends less on innovation than on attention. Bricks demand attention. They crack quietly, they slump slowly, they fail politely, giving warning if you're willing to notice. And that creates a culture attuned to maintenance rather than perfection. Instead of monumental finality, Mesopotamian cities embrace ongoing care. A wall is never finished, it's only in its current state. This mindset shapes everything from architecture to social relationships. Commitments are flexible, repairs expected, continuity assumed rather than guaranteed. Even memory behaves this way. Stories repeat with variations. Myths layer themselves over older myths. Gods merge, separate, return under new names, much like bricks reused upside down in new walls. Nothing is entirely lost, it's just recontextualized. And as centuries stretch on, the contrast between intention and outcome grows sharper. The bricks were made to solve immediate problems, shelter, storage, boundaries, but they end up enabling things no one predicted: bureaucracy, law, literature, urban anonymity, the strange comfort of living among thousands of strangers enclosed by the same fragile material. Cities become places where identity loosens, where roles specialize, where someone can spend their entire life making bricks without ever meeting the king whose name is stamped on them. And yet both depend on the same mud. That shared dependence creates a subtle equality beneath visible hierarchy. No matter how high the ziggurat rises, its core is still sun-dried brick, vulnerable, patient, replaceable. And when floods come, and they always do, the water does not respect status. It seeps into courtyards and temples alike, reminding everyone that permanence here is conditional. But instead of discouraging settlement, this reality deepens attachment. People stay because they know how to rebuild. They stay because the city is not just a place, but a process they participate in. Leaving would mean starting over somewhere without shared walls, without inherited techniques, without the quiet assurance that someone nearby knows how to fix what breaks. And so Mesopotamian cities endure not through strength, but through familiarity, through routines passed down without ceremony, through hands learning the same motions their grandparents learned, through the understanding that survival is collective because no one person can maintain a city alone. And when eventually these places fade from active use, when rivers shift, soils salt, trade routes move on, the bricks do not protest. They return to earth, slowly, gracefully, exactly as they came. Wind smooths them, rain softens them, plants take root where floors once were swept. And future people arrive, seeing only gentle hills, unaware that beneath their feet lie kitchens, storerooms, courtyards, contracts, prayers, arguments, laughter, all compressed into the ground. Which feels like the most honest ending possible for a civilization built from mud. Nothing dramatic, nothing abrupt, just absorption. And as we sit with that image, the slow settling of cities back into landscape, it becomes clear that Mesopotamia's greatest architectural achievement wasn't a specific structure or skyline, but a way of living with impermanence without surrendering to it. The bricks didn't promise eternity, they offered continuity instead. Enough shelter to plan, enough stability to imagine tomorrow, enough structure to hold a society together as long as people were willing to keep showing up, season after season, to mix mud, add straw, and trust the sun to finish the job. And in that quiet agreement between humans and material, civilization found its footing, not on stone, not on certainty, but on patience, repetition, and the belief that even fragile things can hold meaning if enough care is applied over time.